Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you tonight as we continue our series in Exodus. And tonight we are going to attempt to do something that we've never done before in covering chapter 8 and chapter 9. And they're both fairly long chapters. So we're going to try to go ahead and get started. Going back to last week, we are at the point in the Exodus story where Moses and Aaron have went before Pharaoh a few times. And last week we covered the first sign and the first plague. And we seen where the first plague was the water being turned to blood, in particular the surface water of the Nile and all of the reservoirs, and basically any of the surface water that was visible was turned to a red color, and that led to the fish dying and there not being fresh water available to be drank. So they had to scurry and dig wells and try to get water. And the text tells us that that lasted for a week. And so we're kind of looking at sometime around the fall, winter months when these plagues begin, and we're going to see that they last into the springtime with the 10th and final plague, which is obviously taking place at Passover. But we're going to focus on tonight covering a large majority of the plagues. And I want you to look at this screen over here. We're going to start with the second plague, or the third sign, and we're going to cover all the way to the seventh plague, or the eighth sign. And I want you to remember the pattern that I described about the plagues and the signs in general, having a 1-9-1 pattern. You have the first sign that was done before Pharaoh, the throwing down of the rod, and it turned into a tanin. And then you have a series of 3 plagues. You have 3 triads. And each of the 3 triads, or 9 plagues, mirror each other in sequence. Like the first, fourth, and seventh plague mirror each other in the literary, the way it's written in literary form. And then you have the second, fifth, and eighth that mirror each other. And then you have the third, sixth, and ninth that mirror each other. And the way they mirror each other is the first, fourth, and seventh, Moses and Aaron are told to confront Pharaoh as he goes out to the water, presumably to bathe. In the second in each of the triads, the second, fifth, and the eighth, they go to the palace and confront him. And then the third, sixth, and ninth plagues, there is no warning given. The plague simply takes place and judgment proceeds. And I should have a visual here where you can kind of look at this. And we looked at this last week. So again, the first, fourth, and seventh have the outdoor morning confrontation with Pharaoh. The second, fifth, and eighth have the indoor, in the palace, confrontation with Pharaoh. And then you have the third cycle, the third, sixth, and ninth, that have the outdoor symbolic action with limited confrontation. Not only that, this chart shows the length of the plague. The first one's long, the fourth one's long, the seventh one is long. So the first one in each of these 3 triads are long-lasting plagues. And then you come to the second cycle. The second one is long, the fifth one is short, and the eighth one is long. Then you come to the third cycle. The third one is short, the sixth one is short, and the ninth one is short. And so, again, there's a strategic literary layout in how these plagues take place. And then you have the 10th and final plague, which is one in and of itself, and it ultimately brings the release of the Israelites from the bondage of the Egyptians. So With that said, we're going to jump into chapter 8 and verse 1, and we're going to look at the second plague, which is the frogs. And Yahweh spake unto Moses, Go unto Pharaoh, and say unto him, Thus says Yahweh, Let my people go, that they may serve me. And if you refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite all the borders with frogs, and the river shall bring forth frogs abundantly, which shall go up and come into your house, into your bedchamber, upon your bed, and into the house of your servants, and upon your people, and into your ovens, and into your kneading troughs. And the frogs shall come up both on you and your people, and upon all your servants. And the Lord spake unto Moses, Say unto Aaron, Stretch forth your hand with your rod over the streams, over the rivers, over the ponds, and cause frogs to come up on the land of Egypt. And verse 6 says, I'm going to scroll back up. And Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. And we're going to stop right there for just a second. So we've seen, just like the first plague, this plague, the water is what brings forth the plague. And we're going to see a pattern here where we go from the water to the land, both of those being relational to the creation story. And so you have these divine judgments, which are kind of like creation reversals, showing that God is the creator and that he is superior to all the so-called gods that are worshipped in the land of Egypt. And another thing I want to point out before I forget is these judgments, these plagues are very much polemical against the gods that were worshipped in Egyptian polytheism. For example, the plague of the frogs is a judgment believed to be against a frog-headed goddess named Heqt, H-E-Q-T, who was the consort of the god Khnum, who was credited, Khnum, with having fashioned man out of clay, which is interesting that they have their own spin of that. She, the goddess, Heqt, was associated with fertility and was thought to assist women at childbirth. And so this plague here is against the frogs, so which is linked to the goddess that has the frog head. Why that's interesting is the first judgment was against the Nile, and the second plague is against the goddess of fertility. Right? Think about it. What was one of the greatest sins of the Egyptians that they imposed on the Hebrew children? They were thrown into the Nile, right? An attack against their reproduction and multiplication. And so in the first two plagues, there's judgment brought against Egypt in a retribution type manner. Okay, so I want you to envision being overwhelmed with frogs. I know where I live in the woods, and here recently, within the last month, as the weather began to be warmer, there was like a week straight where there were these frogs outside my window, and they were so loud that I had to go and get some earplugs to put in just so I could sleep, because I'm a light sleeper. And so I can only imagine or envision what life would be like with slimy, nasty frogs everywhere, as it said, in their ovens, in their kneading troughs, in their beds, everywhere they can imagine. They are going to be overran by frogs, which are slimy and noisy and messy and stinky. And so you can just imagine how annoying it would be to deal with all of these frogs. And so they bring the judgment forth, and we're going to pick up in verse 7. And the magicians did so with their enchantments and brought up frogs upon the land of Egypt, which is interesting because we've seen they were able to mimic or reduplicate the first sign, which was throwing down of the rods, turning them into tanin. And then we've seen that they were also able to duplicate the turning of the water into blood. And again, here, they're able to duplicate the bringing forth of frogs. Now, I'm not sure why you would want to bring more frogs, into the equation. But the obvious reason is they were proving that there was nothing special about the power of Yahweh, because they were able to do the exact same thing. And so they could appeal to the fact their gods were just as great or greater than even Yahweh. But we're going to see that things are going to change when we get to the next plague, and even the magicians will acknowledge that. But they are able to duplicate this plague, which is why we don't trust in signs or miracles, right? Because even these other deities were able to give powers to these magicians, and they were able to do some obvious miracles, just like Moses and Aaron were able to. Okay? Something that I had in my notes but I forgot to mention last week is Egypt functions as a paradigm or an archetype of the world system. Okay? A system that diabolically opposes the plan and the will of God. And so it's exactly what we see in the book of Revelation. The beast, which is the world system, manifest in two ways, right? The beast from the land and the beast from the sea. Land and water. Imagine that. And what does the beast do? Perform false signs and miracles that causes the world to wander after the beast instead of follow Jesus Christ. And so again, we have an archetype here early in the Exodus story. Verse 8. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, "Entreat Yahweh." So here we have him actually acknowledging Yahweh, because he's sick and tired of these frogs. And that word entreat literally means to pray in an intercessing type of way. Entreat Yahweh that he may take away the frogs from me. So undoubtedly he had attempted to ask his magicians to take away the frogs, and though they could bring frogs forth, they were not able to stop the plague. And so Pharaoh, as a resort, calls for Moses and Aaron and asks them to intercede so that the frogs may be taken away from, as he says, from me, from my people. And watch what he even does here. And I will let the people go that they may do sacrifice unto the Lord. So he promises them, hey, if you'll just cry out to God for me, I'll let you guys go. Wink, wink. In verse 9, Moses said unto Pharaoh, "Glory over me," or have honor over me. And watch what he does here. He sets him up for Yahweh to be glorified. Actually, even though he says to Pharaoh, "Go ahead and have honor over me. When shall I entreat," or intercede, "for you and your servants and for your people, to destroy the frogs from you and your houses, that they may remain in the river only?" So what he does here, as we see in verse 9, is he asks Pharaoh, okay, when do you want me to intercede and stop the plague? And you would think Pharaoh would say, right now, like 10 minutes ago, yesterday, right? You think he would be fed up with the frogs. But watch what he says in verse 10, and this is puzzling. And he said, tomorrow. I just, when I read that, I'm like, I don't get it. Why would you want to wait? He said tomorrow. And he said, be it according to your word. Now, what this is going to do is show, number one, that this is not some naturally slow occurring process. Okay? Because an exact time of tomorrow is said to bring an end to the plague. And we've already seen that the plagues begin instantaneously at the command of Moses and Aaron. So this is going to credit Yahweh in his power in the fact that Moses and Aaron have been sent by Yahweh and is backing them with signs and wonders. So he said, be it according to your word, that you may know that there is none like unto Yahweh our God. And so it's all for Yahweh's glory, which is the purpose of these plagues in any way. Verse 11, and the frogs shall depart from you, from your houses, from your servants, from your people, and they shall remain in the river only. And Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried unto the Lord because of the frogs which he had brought against Pharaoh. For him to ask Pharaoh, basically name when you want them to be gone, shows the confidence that Moses has right now at this point. Even though we've seen him waver early on, he is very confident in what the Lord is doing, and that he can ask at any given time for the plagues to stop, and God will oblige according to his request. So we see the development of Moses trusting God here as the plagues unfold. Verse 13, the Lord did according to the word of Moses. The frogs died out of the houses, out of the villages, and out of the fields. And you can imagine what that would be like, a bunch of frogs decaying everywhere. And they gathered them together upon heaps, and the land stank. And when that happened, right, the frogs are no longer chirping and croaking and jumping around everywhere, but they're heaped up in piles, and they're starting to stink. Now, you've already dealt with dead fish, right? Now you have dead frogs. And so verse 15, in response to that, but when Pharaoh saw there was respite, right? When things changed, and he got his way, he hardened his heart, or caused his heart to be heavy. Notice it says he hardened his own heart. So we've seen it both ways thus far. We've seen God cause his heart to be hardened in bringing forth judgments and plagues against Pharaoh. But we've also seen Pharaoh's part in this, in that he's hardened his own heart. So you have a cause and effect and a response going on from Pharaoh to what God is doing through these plagues. And so he hardened his heart, and he hearkened not unto them as Yahweh had said. So he goes back on his word, and he obviously doesn't let the children of Israel go. And so you know what that means. More judgment is coming, because he's in rebellion and defiance against Yahweh. Verse 16, we're going to start the next plague. And the Lord said unto Moses, say unto Aaron, stretch out your rod, and smite the dust of the land, that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. The word lice there is Cain, and that particular word means a winged biting insect. And there's a lot of debate over what this could be. The proposals are usually gnats, lice, or mosquitoes. And this is the third plague in the fourth sign. So, seeing how this particular Hebrew word Cain, was used as time went on after the Exodus, it's most likely lice or mosquitoes. Okay? So, either one of those would be very annoying, and I think everyone would agree with that. Verse 17, and they did so, for Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod and smote the dust of the earth. It became lice in man and in beast. All the dust of the land became lice throughout all the land of Egypt. And the magicians did so with their enchantments to bring forth lice, but they could not. So there was lice upon man and upon beast. So this is the first plague, the third plague, fourth sign, that the magicians are not able to duplicate. And so there's lice all through the land. In verse 19, watch what is said. Then the magician said unto Pharaoh, this is the finger of God, or finger of a God, Elohim. So they acknowledge that this is not some natural thing. This is something that has taken place at the hand of a God, and this God happens to be Yahweh, who is standing behind Moses and Aaron as they are fulfilling his commands in confronting Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he hearkened not unto them as the Lord had said. So again, his heart is hardened. And this is the other word, the more dominant word for hardened, chazak, strengthened. And he's not listening to the command of Yahweh. Verse 20, and the Lord said unto Moses, rise up early in the morning, and stand before Pharaoh. Lo, he comes forth to the water, and say unto him, thus says Yahweh. So we're moving into the next plague, which is the fourth plague and the fifth sign. And so they confront him again as he goes out to the water. And he says, thus says the Lord, let my people go, that they may serve me. Else if they will not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms. Notice of flies is italicized, because it's not in the original. Matter of fact, this word swarms is an interesting word that is the Hebrew word arov. It's taken from the root word arav, which means mixture. And so most likely what we have here is a mixture of insects, not just one particular kind, just swarms of different kinds of insects. And there are actually some statements back in antiquity that these were types of biting flies, biting insects of some sort. I think one of the particular flies that is associated with this plague is dog flies. But you can see that this word is used 8 times in the entire Hebrew Old Testament. You can see that the majority of them are right here in this passage, which we'll cover as we continue to read, because there's actually a lot of verses that are given to this particular plague. And then you'll see the only other occurrences outside of Exodus here are the 2 other occurrences that are talking about the plagues. And when we get through all the plagues, we'll go back and we'll visit these passages in Psalms. But it says in Psalm 78, he sent different sorts of flies, which captures what this word means, mixture. So there was different kinds, and not just a particular kind. So this would be a very annoying plague like the others, in that you have swarms of insects of the sort like flies, and even biting flies that they're having to deal with. Okay? So I will send swarms of flies on you, upon your servants, upon the people, into the houses. The houses of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground where they are. And I will sever in that day the land of Goshen. So here is something that's unique to this plague, and we'll see that it progresses throughout the rest of the plagues. But in the land of Goshen, which would be this area here, you have the children of Israel are encamped, right, in what has been discovered as Avaris. And so basically what is said here is these swarms are going to affect all of the Egyptians, but not the Israelites in the land of Goshen. The word Goshen being the territory in the Nile Delta. That's kind of a tongue twister. Where they were. And that word is taken from the Hebrew root gush, which means clod, which speaks of the fertility of the land that was there in the delta. Okay? I will sever in that day the land of Goshen in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, to the end you may know that I am Yahweh in the midst of the earth. And I will put a division. Let me scroll up here and let's look at this. And I will put a division. This particular word, pedut, is taken from the root word padah, which means redemption or ransom, which is an odd way to say this. And I will put a redemption or ransom between my people and your people. It really doesn't make sense. And so it's thought that there's a missing consonant in this particular word in the Hebrew, where it should be division, and here's the word here, pedut, should have a resh in this particular word, pardat, which would actually mean division, and that's how the Septuagint's translate it. So here we likely have a scribal error, and it shouldn't be ransom or redemption. Now we will see ransom or redemption take place with the 10th and final plague. But we don't see that here. There's no ransom that is taking place. So I'll put a division between my people and your people. Tomorrow shall this sign be. So the sign is actually predicted when it will take place. And so verse 24 says, and the Lord did so. And there came a grievous swarm of flies into the house of Pharaoh, his servants' houses, into all the land of Egypt. The land was corrupted by reason of the swarms of flies. So you can just envision swarms of flies, different kinds of flies, all throughout the land of Egypt, but none in Goshen. Which again speaks of the fact that this is the hand of God and not some naturally occurring event, because flies don't know social barriers, right? And it's not like Goshen is not like right in the middle of Egypt. So there's no explanation for this plague outside of God's divine intervention in these plagues. Okay? Verse 25. Not that God didn't work in and through nature, but he was involved in a very unique way, is what I'm trying to point out. Verse 25. Pharaoh called for Moses and for Aaron and said, go ye sacrifice to your God in the land. And Moses said, it is not meet so to do, for we shall sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians to Yahweh our God. So basically, Moses says we cannot sacrifice here in the land because it's an abomination to the Egyptians, because the Egyptian had so many gods that were associated to animals, some of which they would be sacrificing to Yahweh, plus they abhorred sheep and goats, which the Israelites were said to be shepherds when you go back to the Genesis story when they arrived into the land. And so Moses says, we know better. And he explains, lo, shall we sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians before their eyes, and they will not stone us? In other words, Moses says, we can't do that. That's just going to make the Egyptians mad, and they're going to stone us. They're going to kill us. We will go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, right? 3 days' journey. We're going and we're never coming back. We're going to be freed. And we're going to sacrifice to Yahweh our God as he shall command us. And so again, he says, no, this is going to be done on Yahweh's terms, Yahweh's way, how he wants it to be done as he is commanded. And Pharaoh said, I will let you go, that you may sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness. Only you shall not go very far away. Entreat for me. Okay, so he makes him the promise. Okay, I'll let you go out in the wilderness. I think we've heard this before already, right? But go intercede for me, because I am tired of the swarms. In verse 29, and Moses said, behold, I go out from you, and I will intercede or entreat the Lord, that the swarms of flies may depart from Pharaoh, from his servants, from his people, tomorrow. But let not Pharaoh deal deceitfully any more in not letting the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. So he calls him out for not letting them go before and says, I'm going to go intercede for you tomorrow, and the plague is going to end, but don't you step back on your word like you have. Okay? Verse 30, Moses went out from Pharaoh and entreated the Lord, and the Lord did according to the word of Moses. And he removed the swarms of flies from Pharaoh, from his servants, from his people, and there remained not one. You've probably noticed by now there's a lot of repetition in the details that are given through the stories in Exodus. So we've seen this in Genesis as well. And I explained the reason why there's this redundant repetition is because they were not a literate society. They would have heard these stories and never laid eyes on these stories, and most of the people wouldn't have been able to read anyhow. And so for memorization purposes, there's a lot of repeating the same details of the stories in the same conversations. But verse 32 says, and Pharaoh hardened his heart at this time. So we have Pharaoh here with a heavy heart. At this time also, neither would he let the people go. So we know that Pharaoh is quite capable of lying, right? And there's a lot for him to lose if he lets them go. They are doing a massive amount of work for his kingdom. And so it's going to take a mighty hand for him to let them go. But didn't Yahweh say it would be that way? He did. So let's continue into chapter 9, and we're going to see the next plague, which is the fifth plague, or the sixth sign, and we're going to see that it's some sort of disease on livestock. Verse 1, Then Yahweh said unto Moses, Go in unto Pharaoh and tell him, Thus says the Lord God of the Hebrews, Let my people go, that they may serve me. Again, this fifth plague is going to be similar to the second plague in the eighth plague. For if you refuse to let them go, and will hold them still, behold, the hand of the Lord is upon your cattle. You had the finger earlier, now you're going to get the whole hand. So the hand of the Lord is going to be upon your cattle. The word cattle here is how the King James translated, but it's the Hebrew word mikaneh, which means possession, and it, broadly speaking, but usually this word is associated with any form and every form of livestock. And so we're going to see that that's what the issue is. The hand of the Lord is upon your livestock, which is in the field, upon the horses, upon the asses, upon the camels, upon the oxen, upon the sheep. There shall be a very grievous murrain. The word sheep there is flocks, more appropriately, because the Egyptians themselves did not keep sheep. Okay, so it's flocks of various sorts. But it said, there shall be a very grievous murrain. The word murrain there is the Hebrew word dever, which is plague. And we don't know the particulars of this plague, but it has often been hypothesized to be some form of anthrax. We'll actually look at an excursus here in a minute that tries to give a naturalistic explanation and sequence for each of these plagues, one relying upon another and each happening over time naturally. But again, we've already seen that that flies against the evidence of what the text actually says, and so we have to reject that as a possibility. But we'll look at what is said in relation to that nonetheless, because we live in a very postmodern culture that really doesn't believe in the supernatural and wants to explain everything in some natural or scientific way. Okay? So verse 4, And the Lord shall sever between the cattle of Israel and the cattle or the livestock of Egypt, and there shall nothing die of all that is in the children of Israel. So again, all of the Hebrew livestock will be spared and safe. 5. And the Lord or Yahweh appointed a set time, saying, Tomorrow the Lord shall do this thing in the land. And the Lord did that thing on the morrow, and all the livestock of Egypt died. Now it says all the livestock of Egypt died, but all cannot mean every last one of them, because we're going to see in the very next plague, which is the boils, and in the 7th plague, the hail, and in the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, that livestock are involved in those judgments as well. So if every last one of them died, they couldn't be judged in the 6th, 7th, and 10th plague, and there would be no horses or chariots that chase the Israelites into the wilderness that are drowned in the Red Sea. So again, all cannot mean every last one of them. So it means a large majority. And all the cattle of Egypt, or the livestock of Egypt, died. But of the livestock of the children of Israel died not one. And watch what Pharaoh does. He wants to see. Because it said there's going to be a distinction between the livestock of the Egyptians and the livestock of the Hebrew people. And Pharaoh sent, and behold, there was not one of the cattle or the livestock of the Israelites dead. And the heart of Pharaoh was hardened or heavy, and he did not let the people go. So again, he responds to this plague in bitterness and hardening of his heart, and he refuses to let them go. So we've made it through half of the plagues, and he still is very much resolved in not allowing the Israelites to go out in the wilderness to worship Yahweh. So we know what's going to happen, right? The 6th plague, which is the last plague in the 2nd triad. So this plague will be similar to the 3rd plague, which was the lice. The Lord said unto Moses and unto Aaron, Take to you handfuls of ashes of the furnace, and let Moses sprinkle it toward the heaven in the sight of Pharaoh. And it shall become small dust in all the land of Egypt. So here we have another judgment that's related to the land. And shall be a boil breaking forth with blain. So this would be inflammation in the skin that burst forth into an open wound. And so watch what it says. Upon man, upon beast, which again means that not all of the livestock died, throughout all the land of Egypt. And that word beast there, behemoth, is the word that is used in the creation story. So again, there are a lot of overtones that are associated with the creation story throughout all the land of Egypt. And they took ashes of the furnace, stood before Pharaoh, and Moses sprinkled it up toward heaven, and it became a boil, breaking forth with blains upon man and upon beast. And watch what happens here. This is very interesting in verse 11. And the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils. And so for the first time, the magicians themselves are directly affected and judged in this plague. For the boil was upon the magicians and upon all the Egyptians. And so we see an intensification in the plagues as we continue to move through them, and they are affecting in more ways, in more extreme ways. And so the boil was upon the magicians and all the Egyptians, and the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, or he caused to be strengthened or hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he hearkened not unto them as Yahweh had spoken unto Moses. So again, he is not backing up. He is not letting the Hebrew people go. You know what that means. More judgment. And we're going to see a very lengthy plague here that is discussed as far as what happens and the effects of this plague. So that takes us to the seventh plague, or the eighth sign, which is going to be hail, lightning, and thunder. And we're going to see that it is similar to which plagues? The first and the fourth plague. Okay? So verse 13. And Yahweh said unto Moses, Rise up early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh and say unto him, Thus says the Lord God of the Hebrews, Let my people go, that they may serve me. For I will at this time send all my plagues upon your heart, and upon your servants, and upon your people, that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth. For now I will stretch out my hand, and I will smite you and your people with pestilence, and you shall be cut off from the earth. And in very deed for this cause have I raised thee up, for to show you in my power, that my name may be declared throughout all the earth. And so we see this recurring theme throughout all of the plagues, and that is what? To make Yahweh's name known throughout all the land, throughout all the earth. Verse 17, As yet exaltest thou yourself against my people, that you will not let them go. Behold, tomorrow, about this time, I will cause it to rain, a very grievous hail, such as has not been in Egypt since the foundation thereof, even until now. Send therefore now and gather your livestock, right? So obviously they hadn't all died earlier. And all that you have in the field, for upon every man and beast which shall be found in the field, and shall not be brought home, the hail shall come down upon them, and they shall die. And so there's actually a warning given here, and they can actually take cover if they so wish and save life. Watch what happens. Verse 20. He that feared the word of Yahweh among the servants of Pharaoh made his servants and his cattle flee into the houses. Good idea, because they've already seen the hand of the Lord. And so some of them actually fear what's going to happen. In other words, they believe that, this plague will come to pass, and so they take action. Verse 21 says, And he that regarded not the word of the Lord left his servants and his cattle in the field. And the Lord said unto Moses, Stretch forth your hand toward heaven, that there may be hail in all the land, upon man, upon beast, upon every herb of the field, throughout the land of Egypt. And Moses stretched forth his rod. Notice who's doing everything here. Moses. Right? Aaron, he kind of gets put on the back burner. So, verse 23, And Moses stretched forth his rod toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail and fire, which would be lightning, ran along upon the ground, and the Lord rained hail upon the land of Egypt. So a massive storm takes place in this plague. In verse 24 it says, So there was hail, and fire mingled with the hail, lightning, very grievous, such as there was none like it in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. And Egypt had a long history at this point, a couple millennium. So this was a major hailstorm. Verse 25, And the hail smote throughout all the land of Egypt, all that was in the field, both man and beast, and the hail smote every herb of the field, and brake every tree of the field. So it's devastating effects. You can just imagine a violent, massive hailstorm, lightning, thunder. You would assume there would be rain that would accompany it, strong winds, etc. And so very devastating effects. Some have even proposed that there would be, tornado-like activity with it, but the text doesn't actually say that. Verse 26, Only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were, was there no hail. so it's not going to affect them like we've seen in the last several plagues. In verse 27, and Pharaoh sent and called for Moses and Aaron and said unto them, I have sinned this time. Yahweh is righteous, and I and my people are wicked. Now, what's gotten into Pharaoh? This is a different tone, right? Evidently, this was a violent happening, and it's not that he's repented. We're gonna see very clearly. Even though he says, "I've sinned, and Yahweh's righteous, and me and my people are wicked," he doesn't mean it, because he doesn't repent and he doesn't obey Yahweh. That is the true sign of repentance, when he submits and obeys Yahweh, which we'll see obviously he's not willing to do it really at any point. Even when he releases them after the 10th and final plague, he tries to go back and capture them again. So verse 28, entreat Yahweh, for it is enough that there be no more mighty thunderings in hell, and I will let you go, and you shall stay no longer. Now, you know he's lying at this point in the story, because he has several times. And Moses said unto him, as soon as I am gone out of the city, I will spread abroad my hands unto the Lord, and the thunder shall cease, neither shall there be any more hail, that you may know how that the earth is the Lord's. Now what's interesting about that is he said, when I get outside of the city, then I'm going to stop it. Which means that the hail and the storm and the lightning and the thunder continue as Moses makes his way out of the city, which shows that he is protected even in the midst of this violent happening, which is very interesting. It should have been of note to the Egyptians as well, and Pharaoh in particular. Verse 30, but as for you and your servants, I know that you will not yet fear the Lord, or Yahweh, Elohim. So Moses sees right through his false promise. And he says, and the flax and the barley was smitten. The flax was used to make linen. It was the fiber that was made for linen, for yarn. And how the flax was done, it was sown beginning in January, and then it bloomed 3 weeks later around the time of February. Okay, so it says that it was smitten. So while it's in bloom, it's crushed by the hail. So the flax is lost, which was a major asset to the Egyptians, because they used that, to produce linens and fibers and yarn, etc. And so that was a major blow to their economy. And so the flax was smitten, and the barley. What is the barley? The barley was planted or sown in August, okay, late summer the year before, and it was always harvested in February. So, the barley would be coming right near the time to be harvested when this plague takes place, and it just destroys their barley harvest, their barley crop. Because it says, for the barley was in the ear and the flax was bold. So, again, you have the flax that is floured, and then you have the barley that was ready to be harvested, and it's all destroyed. Now, what was the barley used for? The barley was used to produce 2 B's, bread and beer, which were major productions throughout the Egyptian Empire. And so again, this is a huge economic blow as well, and many of the other plagues were as well. But watch what it says in verse 32. Now, what else is specific about barley? And why would there be so much attention given to the mentioning of barley and what was destroyed by this particular plague? Because we've seen the other plagues are relatively short in what is said about the plagues and the cause of the plague. The barley is a harvest that would be unique to Israel from this time forward, because the Passover centered around the barley harvest, right? The Passover was the barley harvest, and you have unleavened bread with Passover, and you have first fruits, which was the first fruits of the barley harvest. And then you had later on, let's go ahead and read verse 32 and then I'll explain. But the wheat and the rye, which was another form of wheat, were not smitten, for they were not grown up. That would have been harvested about a month and a half later. And there was a particular feast that centered around the wheat harvest, and they would bring the wheat loaf offerings to the temple when they arrived in the land of Israel. But what feast is associated with the wheat harvest? Anybody know? Pentecost. Okay? But the wheat and the rye were not smitten, for they were not grown up. Okay? So those crops weren't destroyed. And Moses went out of the city from Pharaoh and spread abroad his hands unto Yahweh, just like he said. And the Pharaoh and the thunder and the hail ceased, and the rain was not poured upon the earth. And when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunders were ceased, he sinned yet more, and hardened his heart, he and his servants. And the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, neither would he let the children of Israel go, as the Lord had spoken by Moses. And so we have covered through this seventh plague. And what I want to do, since we had just a few moments, well, we have as long as we want, actually, because you guys are sitting in your pajamas eating ice cream and cereal and who knows what all else. But I want to show you some naturalistic explanation for some of the plagues. Okay, we looked at the first one last week, and this is some of the proposals of those who don't believe in the supernatural, that God could start and stop each of these plagues by his divine command, and those who want to explain everything naturally in some way, shape, or form. So we've seen that in the first plague, the Nile becomes blood, unusually heavy rainfall in the upper Nile headwaters. The flood dissolves and brings red dirt characteristic of the Abyssinian and Ethiopian plateau at the headwaters of the Blue Nile all the way into lower Egypt. Added to the reddish color of the dirt is the reddish color of certain microorganisms known as flagellates, which are always present in the Nile, but because of the flooding and the nutrients brought with it, and which multiply in abundance, making the Nile red in color, undrinkable, and poisonous to the fish. Now that's a process, and that's not what we see in the text. So let's look at the plagues that we looked at today. Plague 2, frogs leave the Nile and go into the houses. The polluted Nile and rotting fish, which in turn breed Bacillus anthraxis or anthrax. Frogs leave the uninhabitable Nile and invade homes, but then die off suddenly because they are killed by the anthrax, which leads to plague 3, mosquitoes, is what they say. Mosquitoes, not the usually postulated gnats or lice. Okay, and they're dependent upon this being mosquitoes, which again, the evidence leans towards it being actually lice. Perfect breeding conditions in pool stagnant water along the Nile as floodwaters recede. Huge swarms of mosquitoes biting humans and animals, which leads to plague 4. Flies, particularly the Stomoxys calcitrans, carrier of anthrax. Perfect breeding conditions in pool stagnant water along the Nile as floodwaters recede. Ingestion during grazing by animals and biting of humans causing plagues 5 and 6. Cattle anthrax, and 6, human skin anthrax. It has to only be skin anthrax for the humans, though, because it doesn't mention them dying because of anthrax. So, little disclaimer. different kind, right? It mutates into a different kind. Anyway, Plague 5, animal death. Anthrax from ingestion of grasses growing out of soil where frogs had died and where the Bacilli anthracis spores were left in the soil. Later, anthrax was cleansed from the soil by spring rain squalls. Non-stabled cattle, those allowed to graze in the field, die, which leads to Plague 6, human skin sores. Skin anthrax from the bite of the Stomoxys calcatrans fly, which had picked up the spores from feeding on dead frogs. Severe skin sores, but no fatalities, as is characteristic generally of cutaneous anthrax. So we got a different kind here again, which leads to Plague 7, which is hail and thunderstorms. Extreme weather conditions not unknown for the time of year. This just happened all the time. Nothing special about it, even though the Bible says there was none like it until that time before. The destruction of flax and barley, but not wheat and spelt, which were not yet up. Okay, so those are some of the naturalistic explanations. I want to look at this excursus where Douglas from the New American Commentary actually talks about, did anthrax cause the 5th and 6th plagues? Again, the 5th plague is the disease on the livestock, and the 6th plague is the boils, the inflammation of the skin that causes protrusions, pus, etc. So let's see what he says about this. A number of commentators and even some medical specialists have raised the possibility that plagues 5 and 6 both represent the effects of anthrax. The arguments in favor of this theory may be summarized with the following scenario. And so here's the theory, and I believe it's just that. Plague 1. The turning of water to blood killed many or most of the fish in the Nile, since anthrax can at least theoretically breed in dead and rotting fish. The huge quantity of rotting fish in and along the banks of the river could have provided a fertile medium for the multiplication of the Bacillus anthracis. The frogs that had been in the Nile were now driven from it by its pollution. Plague 2 carried the anthrax infection as they spread out over the land along the Nile. Since virtually all of Egypt's population in both ancient and modern times was and is located very close to the Nile, the frogs were spreading the anthrax bacillus to much of the inhabited area of Egypt, including the locations where the Egyptian cattle grazed. What killed the frogs where they were all over Egypt and in huge quantities was anthrax. As the dead frog bodies rotted in the sun, anthrax was released in large quantities into the soil where it could remain dormant almost indefinitely. But a long dormancy was not required in this case, even after the smell of the frogs was gone, because their body was desiccated. The anthrax was alive and well in the soil and was beginning to spread to the grasses as they grew from the soil where the frogs had died. When cattle grazed over these grasses, Plague 5, the death of cattle, was caused by anthrax as it multiplied without check into the bodies of the cattle. Meanwhile, all of this flies in the face of what we just read in the text, though, by the way. That's the biggest problem with it. Meanwhile, the breeding conditions for the various sorts of flies, Plague 4, and incidentally mosquitoes, Plague 3, were ideal, since the Nile, as well as the various stagnant pools of water along the Nile, contained large amounts of rotting fish that were anthrax infected. The rotting carcasses of frogs likewise contained anthrax, as would the rotting carcasses of dead cattle. From any and all of these sources, the various flies, but particularly the Stomoxys calcatrans, fed and multiplied. I'm probably butchering that, by the way. Fed and multiplied, becoming carriers of anthrax. Anthrax spores that are inhaled or ingested by humans in large quantities can cause death, as anthrax overwhelms the immune system. Cutaneous anthrax, skin anthrax, however, is not usually fatal. Well, how did it morph into a skin anthrax when it killed the cattle? The last time I checked, cattle are tougher than humans. Okay? Cutaneous anthrax, skin anthrax, however, is not usually fatal. It causes festering sores on the skin, which are painful and debilitating, but most people recover fully from skin anthrax eventually. The description of what the Egyptians were suffering in Plague 6 would seem to comport with an epidemic infestation of anthrax. And now he's going to counter that, thankfully. The problems with the theory that anthrax caused the fifth and sixth plagues, however, are several. First, the theory reflects a normal human tendency to reduce the supernatural to what the natural can comprehend. In effect, people tend to read the brief and rather general descriptions of the effects of the plagues and sometimes quite unconsciously ask, what natural event that I do understand would come closest to being an explanation for this biblical event, the origin and characteristics of which otherwise I do not understand. This tragic, poor display of logic happens a lot concerning Bible prophecy. I've seen so much nonsense in so-called Christianity on Facebook trying to link what we've been dealing with COVID-19 to something tied to the book of Revelation in some way, shape, or form. And it's just crazy to have the mentality that we have to equivocate everything that's written in the Bible to something we're familiar with, what we know, or what we've experienced. That's just totally unnecessary. Anyway, I don't want to get stuck on that. So, sometimes they quite unconsciously ask what natural event that I do understand would come closest to being an explanation for the biblical event, the origin and characteristics of which otherwise I do not understand. It's okay to say we don't know, by the way. The desire to understand an event tends to make a naturalistic explanation enticingly attractive and a supernatural explanation off-putting. If the Bible mentions a divinely caused disease, many people immediately search for whatever known disease seems to come closest to what the Bible describes and assume that to be what the disease must actually have been. Likewise, with disasters, floods, the glory, fire atop Sinai, the empty tomb, and so on, it's always tempting to demythologize biblical miracles. Second, the fifth and sixth plagues do not fit a key criterion for natural epidemics or disasters because they do not develop naturally, that is, gradually and inconsistently from person to person or animal to animal. They come about virtually instantaneously and uniformly according to the timing that is not controlled by nature but overtly by God. One reason for specifically granting Pharaoh the choice of time for ending the plague of frogs was surely so that those who followed the plague stories closely would be reminded of their supernatural origin and conclusion. Third, as the biblical text itself makes clear, the plagues were not mere natural developments, but were supernatural developments related to the natural sphere, purposeful evidences of divine control over the natural world of Egypt, designed to show the one true God's superiority over the natural world as it was pantheistically conceived by the Egyptians. In other words, the plagues imitated nature in certain ways as a means of showing God's control over nature and its gods associated with each of these forms of nature. Ways that can make it easy for a reader mistakenly to think that the plagues were merely natural. Fourth, with regards specifically to the sixth plague, the cause of the disease does not appear to be consistent with its type. Fine particles or airborne dust normally would be associated more with a dust storm, in extreme form a sandstorm, than with anthrax, and contact with airborne particulates would be likely to cause the inhaled form of the disease at least as frequently, if not more commonly, than the skin form, producing death in great numbers rather than simply festering sores. Finally, it is not entirely clear that the fifth and sixth plagues were a single disease, whatever the type. Many things can cause cattle to die. Many things can give animals and humans skin lesions. The most convincing, contextually based understanding of the fifth and sixth plagues, in fact, is that they were somewhat epidemic-like supernatural events intended to humiliate the gods of Egypt, the Egyptians in general, and Pharaoh in particular, and show the objective observer that there was only one God in whom faith should be placed. Were there any objective observers to benefit from the demonstration of the true divine power inherent in the plagues? The answer is yes. The great mixed multitude of non-Egyptian, non-Israelite people living in Egypt along with the Israelites had no reason to identify either with the Egyptians or with the Israelites in analyzing the plagues. They simply saw them for what they were, proof that the God of Israel was supreme over Egypt and the Egyptians, and one whose people they ought to join with if they wish to enjoy a redeemed future. For them, the plague showed the way of salvation by forcibly calling their attention to the God who saves. Accordingly, they seized the chance to leave Egypt when the Israelites did. We'll see that when we get to that part. But again, the naturalistic explanation does not do justice to what we actually see in the text. And so we can reject that based on what the text actually says. Again, we'll return and look at some of these explanations again when we go over the rest of the plagues. But for there, we are going to stop for tonight. I hope everyone is doing well. It appears that they're going to be lifting the ban on being able to meet here soon. We'll keep you updated on that process. In the meantime, keep seeking the Lord, stay in the Word, keep growing, and we will see you in due time. Everyone have a good night.